Today we are going to take a look at the Tanglefoot Hardtack, which is a pretty interesting bike. In the iteration I rode, it seems more capable than a gravel bike, but it isn't in the full-blown drop bar mountain bike category. Do I like it? Is it weird? Find out in this video. The Hardtack is a bike by the bike brand Tanglefoot, which is the house brand of Analog Cycles, that bike shop in Vermont that was once housed in a yurt, but they've since then moved. And it's meant to be the slimmed down version of their Moonshiner, which is their version of a drop bar mountain bike. Biggest differences are that it has a unicrown fork. It doesn't have that biplane fork construction. The fork is also significantly lighter, and it also doesn't use boost spacing. In many ways, it is the svelter, lighter, more supple version of the Moonshiner. The frame and fork are both steel, and it has all the mounts. This is meant to be a super capable bike. You've got braze-ons everywhere to run 3-pack mounts, a rando rack, and fenders front and rear. And in the rear, it also has rear rack mounts. The bike is through axle, and in this particular build, it's rocking some 700 by 50 millimeter Thunderbirds. These are mounted onto some spank rims, which have this interesting vibrocore material inside of it. And I have to say, this is one of the more interesting things about this bike build. On my first few rides of the bike, it felt like it had a flat tire. Everything was kind of dull and muted. I checked the tire pressure, and it's what I would typically run. So it really comes down to that material in the rim. It was pretty noticeable, not in just like a small way, but I think anyone hopping on this bike would notice it. Moving on, cable actuated disc brakes by the brand Rever. And these are par with a BB7 or TRP Spire. Not super baller, but definitely a solid brake. Looking at the cockpit, this is where things get interesting once again. First thing you'll probably notice is the stem. This bike is designed around using a short zero offset, or in this case, I think it's like 35 millimeter offset stem. And that's accomplished by having a longer top tube. The handlebars are by Ritchie. They are a Venture Max. The shifters are mechanical SRAM rival with the ratio mod, so it can run the Eagle drivetrain in the rear. And this bar tape is pretty interesting. It's this corded pants texture, which is oddly comforting when you're riding on the bike. In the main triangle, it's got 3 bottle mounts. The ones interior in the frame are the 3-pack style, so that gives you adjustability to run the bottles higher or lower, depending on if you want to try to fit in a frame bag. Moving down to the cranks, they are by the brand Ignite Components. If you missed our live stream, you should definitely watch it. These cranks are designed using this tool called generative design, where the software creates kind of an optimized form when you give it certain parameters. And they tend to look a little alien-esque, if you will, but pretty cool stuff. If you want to learn more about generative design and Ignite components, check out the link in the description below. The cranks are finished off with a wolf tooth chainring and some super grippy Chromag Scarab pedals. And in the rear, a big 12-speed Eagle cassette with an Eagle rear derailleur. And lastly, I have been riding this bike with the Trans X seat lever actuated dropper, which I'm a huge fan of. The bike as you see it with the dropper post is actually a fairly decent 26 pounds. If you used a non-dropper saddle, that would bring it down to 25 pounds. So while not an ultralight bike, it's still surprisingly light to me for this style bike. That's all the boring kind of component stuff. How does it actually ride? First off, I was really interested in how James designs the front end here. Again, it's designed around the use of a zero offset stem or very short stems combined with wide drop bar handlebars. The head tube angle is relatively slack when compared to kind of road cross inspired gravel bike at 69 degrees, and it has a fair amount of offset at 63 in the fork. With the 700 by 50 tires, this amounts to a trail of 73. So higher than an endurance road bike, much lower than a full-on downhill mountain bike. But I think that's also part of the story because this bike, for its size, has a really long front center. So Russ, you've said all these words. What does it mean? In this particular configuration, the bike steers fairly neutral to neutral stable to me. On flat sections, you didn't have to micromanage it. It would just kind of roll on through everything. Slow speed climbing on the chonky stuff, it's not as controlled as a low trail bike, but it wasn't wandering all over the place. I think where this bike shines is descending. This is one of the most fun, stable descending bikes I've ridden in a while. Going on long, straight stretches of gravel, you can really tuck in and feel super confident that you're not going to be bumped off course. Taking it on single track, it was still super fun and capable. It didn't quite have the super swoopy, slack feeling of the modern mountain bike. It was a little bit more restrained than that. But on the green trails and some of the blue trails, I rode it here in Missoula. It performed great. The rear of the bike is fairly long by today's gravel bike standards at 450, so this equates to a really smooth ride. This is a bike where if you prioritize comfort and stability and riding long miles and not having to kind of micromanage the steering, then this bike is for you. To me, it feels like a little bit more capable gravel bike, if you will, gravel plus, if that's a thing, where I think it would be better suited on some chonky stuff than your typical cross-inspired gravel bike. However, especially in this configuration with these tires, it's not as burly and let's say capable as a full-on drop bar mountain bike, something like the Stargazer or even the Moonshiner with those bigger tires. I think that the nature of the bike, the handling of the bike will change depending on tire choice, but as this was built with the 700 by 50s, to me it felt like a gravel plus bike. I'd hate to pigeonhole it just for that, but I do think if you put on 27.5 by 2.6 inch tires, the bike will feel a lot more capable, but will also change some of the handling characteristics. I know some of you are saying, well, this bike is just like fill in the blank. So I'm going to address that. I think out of the bikes I've ridden, it feels closest to a Salsa Cutthroat in my opinion. It has that same smooth riding characteristics. I do think it differs in that this has a longer front center. So even with the 700 by 50 millimeter tire, I had no problems with toe overlap, whereas with the Cutthroat, I felt like I was struggling with that. Compared to the Ritchie Ascent, again, in this configuration, this bike actually felt like the more nimble bike. I think part of that is tire width, but this bike just felt that slightest bit more responsive. Another bike people will probably compare this to is the Surly Ghost Grappler. I think they're fairly different. The Ghost Grappler is really tucked in the rear. I think the rear on the Ghost Grappler is 425, so it does have that jumpiness when you stand on the pedals. This is a much smoother accelerating bike. The Ghost Grappler also has much higher trail and does exhibit more of that swoopy, progressive mountain bike steering. This one is more like a chilled out gravel front end than it is to a mountain bike front end, at least in my opinion. All right, so who is this bike for? As it's built, probably wouldn't be the choice if you're on the pointy end of a gravel race, but if you ride more party pace, are a participant, or are doing super long endurance events where comfort is more of a priority than that feeling of outright speed, then this bike is perfect for that. It's also perfect for touring, for doing a lot of paved and unpaved surfaces. It's got all the mounts, so it also makes a super functional commuting bike. So yeah, I'm digging it. I really want to set this up with some sweat back bars to see how it rides. But to me, this really fits that bill where you want a little bit more bike than your typical, cross-inspired gravel bike, but not so much bike that you're going to feel bogged down if you're commuting or have a lot of paved surfaces. Again, just splitting those hairs here. But I dig it. To be honest, one of my favorite bikes that I reviewed so far this year. But that's what I think. What do you guys think about this bike? If you have any questions, leave those in the comments below. If you appreciate these reviews, consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon or buying some of our new stickers. We've got some fun retro themed stickers in the store. And as always, everybody, keep the supple side down.